You're just the driver. Try not to exist. The line landed lightly, almost casual, but it stayed in the air longer than it should have, like something that didn't belong in a place this polished. The valet stand outside the glass-walled hotel buzzed with quiet efficiency, heels tapping against marble, soft greetings exchanged under breath, engines idling in neat rows. Marcus Reed stepped out of the black sedan and walked around to open the rear door, his movements unhurried, precise, like he had done this 1,000 times and never once needed to prove it. Victoria Hale didn't look at him when she stepped out. Her phone was already pressed to her ear, voice sharp, controlled, slicing through numbers and expectations like she was holding the entire room together from a distance. She paused just long enough to adjust her coat, then glanced at him, not to see him, but to place him. "Don't touch anything inside unless I say so," she added, quieter this time, but not softer. "You're just the chauffeur." Marcus nodded once. No reaction, no shift in posture. He closed the door with care, not because she asked, but because that was how he did things. Around them, the city moved in polished silence, tailored suits, filtered sunlight bouncing off mirrored glass, a world built on appearances that never cracked in public. Marcus returned to the driver's seat, adjusted the rearview mirror by half an inch, and waited. In the reflection, he caught a brief glimpse of her before she disappeared into the revolving doors. Perfect posture, controlled stride, the kind of presence that filled rooms before she even spoke. But for a fraction of a second, something didn't align. Not weakness, not doubt, just weight. The kind people carried when no one was looking. He looked away first. The engine idled low, steady. A few minutes passed. A delivery truck double-parked across the street. Someone laughed too loudly near the entrance, then quickly quieted down. Marcus reached for the paper cup in the console. The coffee had gone cold, but he drank it anyway, eyes steady on the exit. No impatience, no distraction, just presence. Inside, behind layers of glass and steel, deals were being shaped, decisions measured in millions, voices raised and lowered with calculated precision. Out here, none of that mattered. Out here he waited. Not because he had to, because he chose to finish what he started. Another car pulled up behind him, the driver stepping out, glancing around with restless energy. Marcus didn't turn. He didn't compare. He didn't rush. The mirror held only what was necessary. The entrance, the reflection of movement, the quiet rhythm of people passing through a world that rarely noticed who kept it running. Somewhere above, a door opened. The flow shifted. And without thinking, Marcus straightened slightly, not in anticipation, but in readiness. Not for her status, not for her tone, just for the moment. Because moments, he knew, were where people showed who they really were. And he had learned a long time ago, you don't interrupt that. You witness it. Then you decide who you're going to be anyway. By the time the glass doors closed behind her, Marcus had already shifted his attention back to the quiet details most people ignored. The low hum of the engine, the faint reflection of clouds drifting across the windshield, the rhythm of footsteps passing without purpose. 20 minutes later, Victoria returned, her pace faster now, her voice still anchored to the call that had not ended, numbers sharper, tone thinner, like something inside the conversation had started to slip. She entered the car without looking at him, the scent of her perfume subtle but precise, controlled like everything else about her. "We are not revising that clause," she said into the phone, her words measured but carrying an edge that did not need to rise to be felt. Marcus pulled away from the curb smoothly, merging into traffic without interruption, his hands steady on the wheel, eyes forward but aware. The city moved around them in layers, delivery vans edging through narrow gaps, pedestrians crossing before signals changed, sunlight catching on glass towers and falling into the car in brief, shifting patterns. Victoria leaned back slightly, closing her eyes for just a second too long before opening them again, as if even that moment of rest felt like a risk. "Then they can walk," she said, quieter now, but heavier, like the decision had already begun to cost her something. The call ended without goodbye. Silence filled the car, not empty, but dense, like it carried everything she did not say. Marcus adjusted the rearview mirror again, not to see her more clearly, but to keep the angle consistent, the frame balanced. In that reflection, he saw it again, not weakness, not uncertainty, but fatigue that did not belong to someone who allowed themselves to slow down. They stopped at a red light. A school bus rolled past on the opposite side, bright yellow against the gray of the street, children visible through the windows, some laughing, some staring out without focus. Marcus watched it pass, just for a second, then returned his attention to the road. "Take the long route," Victoria said suddenly, her voice lower now, almost detached. "I need time." Marcus nodded once. He did not ask why. He turned at the next intersection, away from the faster route, toward quieter streets lined with older buildings and small storefronts that had not changed in years. The noise softened there. Fewer horns. Less urgency. Just movement without pressure. Victoria did not speak again, but her posture shifted, shoulders lowering by a fraction, her grip on the phone loosening as it rested in her hand. Marcus drove at a steady pace, not too slow, not too fast, matching the rhythm of the street rather than forcing it. A breeze moved through a slightly open window, carrying the faint scent of coffee from a corner shop as they passed. Victoria glanced outside, just briefly, like she had not noticed a place like this in a long time. Marcus did not turn. He did not point it out. He simply kept driving, holding the space steady, giving her something she did not know she had asked for, and expecting nothing in return. The car slowed as they turned onto a quieter block where the buildings stood lower and closer together. Their signs faded but familiar, the kind of street that did not try to impress anyone and did not need to. Marcus pulled over gently near a small cafe with a worn awning and a hand-painted sign in the window. He reached forward and turned the dial on the dashboard, lowering the air just enough to let the outside air settle in. Victoria did not ask why they stopped. She only looked up, her eyes scanning the street as if it belonged to a different city than the one she had just left behind. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, almost absently, she spoke. 5 minutes. Marcus nodded once and stepped out of the car. The afternoon light had softened, no longer sharp against the glass towers, but warmer here, catching on brick and wood and small details that did not rush to disappear. He walked into the cafe without hesitation. Inside, the space was narrow but steady, filled with the low murmur of conversation and the quiet rhythm of cups being set down, chairs shifting, a door opening and closing without urgency. Marcus approached the counter and ordered without looking at the menu. 1 coffee, black. 1 hot chocolate, extra milk, not too hot. He waited near the end of the counter, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes moving only when necessary. A small child at a nearby table laughed, the sound light and unguarded, cutting through the room in a way that made everything else pause for just a second. Marcus glanced over, then back again. When the drinks were ready, he carried them carefully, balancing both without spilling a drop, and stepped back outside. Victoria was still in the car, her phone resting in her lap now, her gaze no longer fixed on the screen, but somewhere beyond it. He opened the door slightly and placed the hot chocolate on the center console. "It is not too hot," he said, his voice even, not assuming she would take it, not explaining why he brought it. She looked at the cup, then at him, confusion flickering across her face before settling into something quieter. "I did not order this," she said, but her tone had lost its edge. Marcus closed the door gently. "I know," he replied, and returned to the driver's seat. He picked up his own coffee, still black, still simple, and took a small sip before placing it back down. The car remained still, engine low, the world outside continuing without them. Victoria reached for the cup after a moment, her fingers wrapping around it cautiously, testing the warmth before lifting it slightly. She did not drink right away. She just held it, as if the temperature alone was enough to anchor her back into the moment. Marcus did not look at her. He adjusted the mirror again, not to observe, but to maintain the same quiet alignment he always kept. In the reflection, the sharp lines of her expression had softened, just enough to notice, just enough to matter. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. The space between them had shifted, not dramatically, not completely, but in a way that could not be undone. And for the first time since she stepped into the car, Victoria Hale did not look like someone who was trying to stay ahead of something. She looked like someone who had, for a brief moment, stopped running. Marcus pulled the car back into motion after a few quiet minutes, easing into the street with the same measured control, as if nothing needed to be rushed to matter. Victoria still held the cup in her hands, the warmth now settled, no longer surprising, just present. She took a small sip, careful at first, then another, her eyes drifting back to the window where the city had begun to change again, the smaller buildings giving way to taller structures, the slower rhythm tightening into something more familiar to her world. But she did not reach for her phone. Not yet. The silence between them remained, but it was no longer heavy. It had shape now, something defined by what had already happened rather than what needed to be said. As they approached a stoplight, Marcus slowed gradually, his gaze steady ahead. A slight shift in the back seat caught his attention, something small, almost out of place. He glanced once in the rearview mirror, then again, more deliberately this time. Tucked against the edge of the seat, partially hidden beneath a folder Victoria had dropped earlier, was a piece of paper, folded once, its corner bent from being handled too many times. It did not belong to her. He could tell by the way it was worn, by the uneven edges, by the faint marks of color pressing through from the other side. The light turned red. The car came to a complete stop. Marcus reached back carefully, not intruding, just enough to lift the paper free without disturbing anything else. "This might have been left behind," he said, his voice calm, offering it without assumption. Victoria turned, her brow tightening slightly as she took the paper from his hand. She unfolded it slowly, almost without thinking, and for a moment, the world outside seemed to fade behind the simple image in front of her. It was a drawing. Crayons pressed firmly into the page, colors slightly outside the lines, but deliberate in their intent. A man stood at the center, tall, steady, drawn with broad shoulders and a simple smile. Beside him, a small girl, her hand reaching up, connected to his without hesitation. Above them, in uneven letters, written with care more than precision, were the words, "My dad always shows up." Victoria stared at it longer than she expected to. Something in her expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone watching from the outside, but enough that the air in the car changed again. She looked up, meeting Marcus in the mirror for the first time, not with authority, not with dismissal, but with a question she did not fully understand yet. "Your daughter?" she asked quietly. Marcus nodded once. She forgot it this morning. His tone did not change. There was no explanation attached, no story offered to fill the space. Just the fact, simple and complete. Victoria looked back at the drawing, her fingers tracing the edge of the paper lightly, as if the texture itself carried something she could not name. Outside, the light turned green. Cars behind them began to move. Marcus shifted his foot to the gas, guiding the car forward again, steady as before. Victoria folded the paper carefully this time, more precise than the way she had opened it, and held it for a moment before placing it gently on the seat beside her, no longer hidden, no longer overlooked. She leaned back slightly, her gaze no longer fixed on the world outside, but not returning to her phone either. And for the first time, the space between them did not feel like distance. It felt like something waiting to be understood. The car came to a gradual stop in front of a high-rise building where the glass reflected the late afternoon sun in sharp, blinding angles, the kind of place where everything moved fast and nothing waited for anyone. Marcus shifted the gear into park and stepped out first, walking around to open the rear door with the same quiet precision, the same consistency that did not change no matter where he was. Victoria did not move right away. The drawing rested beside her, no longer folded, its edges now aligned carefully, as if it deserved more attention than anything else in the car. Her phone buzzed once, then again, the screen lighting up with urgency, but she did not reach for it immediately. When she finally did, her expression changed the moment she read the message, the softness from earlier, tightening into something sharper, more familiar, but this time, less controlled. "They are pulling out," she said under her breath, not to Marcus, not to anyone, just stating it as if saying it out loud might slow it down. She stepped out of the car, already dialing, her voice returning to that precise edge, but there was something different now, something slightly off balance. "No, that was not the agreement," she said, pacing a few steps away from the entrance, heels striking the pavement in a rhythm that did not match her words. Marcus remained by the car, one hand resting lightly on the door, not watching her directly, but aware of every shift in tone, every pause that stretched a little too long. If they walked now, The entire structure collapses, she continued, her voice lowering, more controlled, but carrying something heavier beneath it. A silence followed, longer this time. Then another voice through the phone, too faint to hear, but enough to change her posture completely. She stopped moving, completely still. I understand, she said finally, but it did not sound like agreement. It sounded like something closing. The call ended. She lowered the phone slowly, her hand lingering there for a second before dropping to her side. The building behind her stood tall, unchanged, indifferent. People moved past her, entering, exiting, continuing with their schedules as if nothing had shifted. But for her, something had. She turned back toward the car, her expression composed again, but thinner now, like it was held together instead of natural. Marcus met her at the door, opening it without a word. She paused before getting in, her eyes flicking briefly to the driver's seat, then to him, as if she was about to say something, but the thought did not fully form. Instead, she sat down, the movement slower than before, more deliberate. The drawing remained beside her. She looked at it once, then away. Marcus closed the door and returned to his seat, starting the engine with the same steady motion. He did not ask what happened. He did not offer anything unnecessary. The car pulled away from the curb, merging back into the flow of traffic, but inside, the rhythm had changed. Victoria leaned back, her gaze unfocused, no longer tracking the city outside, no longer anchored to her phone. The deal, whatever it had been, was no longer in motion. It had stopped. And for the first time, she did not immediately reach for control. She just sat there, in the quiet, with something unfamiliar settling in, something she could not solve with a call or a number. Marcus drove on, steady as before, but his eyes shifted once to the mirror, catching the reflection of the drawing still resting beside her, the simple words written in uneven lines. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Some things, he knew, did not need to be explained to be understood. The car continued through the city in steady motion, but the atmosphere inside had changed in a way that could not be reversed by simply adjusting speed or direction. Victoria Hale sat back in silence, her hands resting loosely near the drawing, though her attention was no longer fully on it. The phone in her lap stayed dark for longer than usual, as if even the smallest decision to reopen it required more energy than she had left. Outside, the streets grew denser again, headlights reflecting off glass buildings, the flow of traffic tightening into overlapping lanes of motion and hesitation. Marcus Reed kept his focus forward, hands steady on the wheel, maintaining the same controlled rhythm he always did, but there was a subtle awareness in him now, the kind that came from recognizing when silence was no longer just silence, but pressure building without release. After several minutes, Victoria finally reached for her phone. Her movements were slower than before, not uncertain, but reduced, as if each action had been measured and found heavier than expected. She unlocked the screen, stared at it for a moment, then placed it back down without making a call. "It is falling apart faster than I expected," she said quietly, not directing the words at Marcus, but not fully keeping them to herself either. There was no response immediately. The car passed beneath an overpass where shadows briefly swallowed the light, and for a few seconds, everything felt narrower, closer. Marcus waited until the road opened again before speaking. "Sometimes things do not fall apart suddenly," he said calmly. "They just reveal where they were already weak." Victoria turned her head slightly, looking at him in the mirror rather than directly. Her expression tightened, not in disagreement, but in the discomfort of hearing something that did not offer comfort in the usual way. "That is easy to say when you are not inside it," she replied, her voice controlled but carrying a strain that had not been there earlier. Marcus did not react to the edge in her tone. He adjusted the mirror slightly, then returned his hand to the wheel. "I am inside it," he said simply, "just not in the same way." The words settled without emphasis, without attempt to persuade. The car moved through another intersection, green lights stretching ahead in a rhythm that felt indifferent to personal urgency. Victoria looked out the window again, this time longer, as if searching for something in the passing shapes of buildings and people that might explain the weight she was carrying. But there was nothing visible to match it. Everything outside continued as normal. That contrast made her exhale slowly, a breath she had been holding without realizing. "If this deal collapses," she said after a moment, her voice lower now, less defensive. I do not know what comes next. Marcus remained quiet for a few seconds, letting the space exist without filling it too quickly. When he spoke, his voice stayed even, unforced. Then you deal with what comes next, he said. One step at a time, not all at once. Victoria did not respond immediately. Her gaze dropped to the drawing beside her again. The simple image now carrying a different kind of weight than before, not as a reminder of failure or success, but of something steady that did not depend on outcomes. The car turned onto a wider avenue, the city opening slightly, light spreading across the dashboard in soft shifts. Marcus kept driving, not faster, not slower, simply continuing forward. And in that continuity, something in the air between them began to settle, not resolved, not fixed, but no longer breaking in real time. The car entered a stretch of road where the buildings on both sides rose higher again, casting longer shadows across the lanes, and the flow of traffic tightened into a steady pressure that felt almost synchronized with Victoria Hale's breathing. She had not spoken for several minutes, but her silence was no longer empty. It carried thought, calculation, and something closer to uncertainty than she would have allowed herself to name earlier in the day. Marcus Reed maintained his steady pace, eyes forward, hands relaxed but precise on the wheel, as if the rhythm of driving itself was the only constant that needed to be preserved. Victoria finally broke the silence, her voice lower than before, less controlled, more honest in its fragmentation. They are not just pulling out because of numbers, she said. They are reacting to something I am not seeing. Marcus did not respond immediately. He waited until the car passed through a green light, letting the motion stay uninterrupted, as if answers required the right kind of space to exist. Then look at it differently, he said simply. Victoria exhaled through her nose, a controlled breath that still carried tension. I have looked at it every way possible, she replied. Financial projections, risk models, market response. Nothing explains this shift. Marcus adjusted his grip slightly on the wheel, not out of discomfort, but out of presence, as if grounding his words before speaking them. Sometimes people do not respond to projections, he said. They respond to pressure they feel, but cannot explain. Victoria turned her head slightly toward him, her expression tightening again, but this time not from disagreement. It was from the discomfort of being pulled away from familiar logic. That is not how deals are closed, she said. Marcus remained calm. It is how people decide, he replied. Another silence followed, longer this time, filled only by the soft sound of tires moving over pavement and the distant rhythm of the city continuing its own priorities. They approached a slower intersection, and Marcus reduced speed without hesitation, allowing the moment to stretch instead of forcing it forward. Victoria looked down at the folded structure of the situation in her mind, trying to find where the missing piece belonged, but every angle she turned it from still led back to the same uncertainty. Then what would you do? She asked finally, her voice quieter, less defensive now. If you were inside that room? Marcus did not answer right away. He let the question settle fully before speaking, as if ensuring it was understood not just as words, but as weight. I would stop trying to win it, he said, and start understanding what they are afraid of losing. Victoria's eyes held on him longer this time, not searching for contradiction, but for clarity. The simplicity of the statement did not reduce its impact. It redirected it. The car continued forward, but something in the direction of her thinking had already shifted. Marcus kept his gaze on the road, voice steady as he continued. You are trying to prove value through logic, he said, but they are making decisions through survival. The words settled into the space between them without force, but with undeniable presence. Victoria leaned back slowly, her gaze drifting toward the window again, but this time she was not looking at the city passing by. She was looking inward, at the structure of assumptions she had built without questioning them. For the first time since the morning began, she did not immediately counter what she heard. She simply listened, and in that listening, something that had been rigid began to loosen, not completely, not cleanly, but enough to change what came next. The car slowed as they approached the entrance of a modern glass tower where security lights reflected across polished stone and the flow of people moved with a quiet urgency, each step guided by schedules that did not allow hesitation. Marcus Reed brought the vehicle to a smooth stop near the designated drop-off zone, keeping the engine running at a low, steady rhythm. Victoria Hale did not immediately move. She sat still for a moment longer than usual, her attention no longer fixed on her phone or the world outside, but on something internal that had been shifting since their last exchange. When she finally reached for the door handle, she paused, then spoke without turning fully toward him. "You said I was looking at it the wrong way," she said. Marcus nodded once, waiting. She continued, her voice quieter now, less certain than earlier in the day. "If that is true, then what would you actually do when you were standing in front of them?" Marcus did not answer right away. He looked through the windshield at the building ahead, at the movement of people entering and exiting, at the controlled chaos of decisions being made behind glass walls. Then he spoke with the same calm precision he always carried. "I would not try to convince them," he said. "I would make them feel understood before asking them to decide anything." Victoria absorbed the words without interruption. For the first time, she did not immediately evaluate them through data or strategy. She simply let them exist. She opened the door slowly and stepped out, adjusting her coat. As the wind moved lightly through the space between buildings, Marcus exited the car as well, walking around to stand near the front, maintaining his usual position, but something in the distance between them had changed. Victoria looked up at the building, then back at him. "Come inside," she said suddenly, almost as if the thought had arrived before she had time to filter it. Marcus did not move immediately. It was not hesitation in the usual sense, but consideration of boundaries that had never been crossed before. "I am just the driver," he replied evenly. Victoria shook her head slightly. "Not today," she said. Inside the lobby, the air was cooler, controlled, designed to remove unpredictability. As they entered together, subtle attention shifted around them. A receptionist glanced up, then down again, then up once more, as if recalibrating assumptions. Victoria walked ahead, but Marcus remained just behind her pace, not following, not leading, simply present. As they approached the private conference level, Victoria slowed again, her hand brushing lightly against a glass railing. "They will not listen to me the way they did before," she said quietly. Marcus looked at her reflection in the glass rather than directly at her. "Then stop trying to be the version of you they expect," he said. A security attendant briefly checked credentials. Marcus's name appeared on a temporary visitor list, but something about it made the attendant pause for a fraction longer than necessary. Victoria noticed this. She did not comment, but her attention sharpened slightly. When they reached the elevator, she finally asked, "Have you been here before?" Marcus paused before answering. "Not like this," he said. The elevator doors closed, sealing them into a quiet vertical movement upward. Victoria stood still, the weight of the meeting weighting above them, but her focus was no longer entirely on the outcome. It was on him, on the quiet consistency he carried, on the way people seemed to recalibrate without fully understanding why. And in that enclosed space, between floors and expectations, something unspoken began to take shape, not as a revelation, but as a slow recognition that the assumptions she had built around him were incomplete. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, releasing them into a floor designed for decisions that carried weight beyond the room itself. The conference space stretched wide with floor-to-ceiling glass on one side, offering a view of the city below, where traffic moved like distant currents and people appeared small enough to be momentary thoughts. Inside, a long table sat at the center, surrounded by executives already in place, their attention divided between documents, screens, and the anticipation of what would determine the outcome of their day. Victoria Hale stepped forward first, her posture restored to the version of herself the world recognized, controlled, precise, prepared. Marcus Reed followed a few steps behind, not attempting to match her authority, not shrinking from it either, simply existing in the space without disruption. A few glances moved toward him, brief and uncertain, but no one spoke. Victoria began the meeting immediately, presenting with clarity, her voice structured, her arguments aligned with every metric and projection they had prepared. But as she spoke, Marcus remained still near the edge of the room, observing not the slides, but the reactions. Subtle shifts in posture, eyes that lingered too long, hands that adjusted papers without reading them. When one of the senior partners interrupted with a question that challenged the foundation of her proposal, Victoria responded quickly, reinforcing data, reinforcing logic, reinforcing certainty. But the response did not land the way it should have. Marcus stepped forward slightly, just enough to be noticed, not enough to interrupt. "May I add something?" he said calmly. The room paused. Victoria turned toward him, her expression controlled but uncertain for a fraction of a second. After a brief silence, she nodded once. Marcus walked closer to the table, not rushing, not performing, simply arriving at a point where his voice could be heard without force. "You are all evaluating this based on risk," he said. "But the concern I heard earlier is not about numbers. It is about control, about what changes for each of you if this moves forward." The room shifted subtly, not in agreement, but in attention. He continued without raising his voice. "If you remove the assumption that this is only a financial decision, you can see what is actually being protected here. Not profit, position, stability, identity." Victoria watched him carefully now, her earlier certainty replaced by a quiet focus she had not anticipated feeling in her own meeting. One of the executives leaned back slightly, no longer looking at the screen. Another closed the folder in front of them without realizing it. Marcus did not push further. He stopped, letting the words settle instead of expanding them. Silence filled the room, not empty, but active, like something being reconsidered in real time. Then the senior partner who had spoken earlier exhaled slowly. "That is not how it was presented," he said. Marcus nodded once. "Because most presentations avoid what people are actually deciding." Victoria finally spoke again, but her voice had changed. It was no longer just leadership. It carried alignment. "If we adjust the structure to address that concern directly," she said, turning slightly toward the table, "we are not changing the deal. We are stabilizing it." Heads around the table began to move, not in agreement yet, but in reconsideration. The energy in the room shifted from resistance to calculation. Marcus stepped back to his original position, returning the space to Victoria without reclaiming attention. The conversation continued, but now it moved differently, less rigid, more open to reinterpretation. Minutes later, when the meeting concluded without final opposition, Victoria remained standing at the head of the table as others began to gather their materials. For a brief moment, she did not speak. She simply looked at Marcus across the room, not as a driver, not as someone unexpected, but as someone whose presence had changed the outcome without ever demanding credit for it. And in that quiet realization, she understood that what had shifted inside the room was not the deal itself, but the way she understood the people making it.